Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we are studying Daf Yud Zayin, Daf 17 of Masechta Pesachim. Very kind of Tuma and Tari kind of Daf today. So we continue with kind of what we got to at the end of the day yesterday with Hagai quizzing the kohanim about their knowledge of Tuma and Tara. So we see a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel regarding that. And then kind of a continuation of like what we saw by Yossi ben Yuezer Ish Sreda yesterday about mashkin in the Beis HaMikdash. We'll see a machlokas between Rav and Levi regarding that. And at the end, we are going to discuss the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Tumas mashkin, a continuation of the machlokes that we discussed at the end of the daf 2 days ago, which was really at sort of the top of yesterday's daf. Let us begin on daf Yud Zayin, 3 lines from the top. Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top. Gufa, we said at the end of the day yesterday, Rav Amr ishtabish kohane, and now this is new, Ushmuel Amr lo ishtabish kohane. Okay, so if you remember from the end of the day yesterday, so Hagai was testing the kohanim at the beginning of the second temple to see if they remembered the laws of Tuma and Tara, because they were away from the temple for a while. So he asked them, what happens if you have a sheretz, and the sheretz touches some bread and makes it a rishon, and then the bread touches some kind of a stew and makes that stew a sheni, and then the stew touches some wine and makes that wine a shlishi, and then that wine touches some oil. Is that oil tameh or not? And they said, no, it's not tameh. And Rav says they were mistaken, because really that oil would be tameh, it would be a revi'i. So Shmuel, however, says that they were not making a mistake. Okay, fine. Rav Omar ishtabish kahane. Rav says that they were making a mistake, revi'i ba'kodesh ba'aminayu. Well, because Hagai was asking them about a revi'i by kodshim, and they said it was tahor, but of course we know that a revi'i is tameh by kodshim. Technically it's possible, I guess. Ushmuel Amar lo ishtabish kahane. Shmuel says the kohanim were not mistaken. Chamishi ba'kodesh ba'minayu ve'amru le tahor. Hagai was asking about a chamishi by kodshim, and of course, who's ever heard of a chamishi by kodshim? And that's exactly what the kohanim said. Who's ever heard of a chamishi by kodshim? And they were correct. There is no such thing as a chamishi by kodshim. So the kohanim were correct according to Shmuel. Now says the Gemara, Bishlam al-Rav, I understand Rav's opinion. Hanu dichsiv arba'a. That is why the pasuk says 4 items. It lists 4 items. Lechem, that would be the rishon l'tumah. Vinozid, some kind of a stew, that would be a sheni l'tumah. V'yayin, wine, v'shemen, oil. Those are 4 items. I.e., it gets down to revi'i l'tumah. And Rav says that they made a mistake. They said that it would be tahor, but the truth is that it would be tameh. El l'shmuel chamisha minale. But where does Shmuel come up with 5 things? There are only 4 things listed in the pasuk. How are you going to get to a chamishi l'tumah? So the Gemara answers, for Shmuel, miksiv v'naga knafo. It doesn't say in that pasuk by Hagai that the thing in his corner touched the bread, right? Like the thing on the corner of his garment touched the bread, i.e. the sheretz, which is an avatuma, directly touched the bread, making it a rishon l'tumah. Rather, it says v'naga bichnafo ksiv b'mashe naga bichnafo. No, it says it doesn't say v'naga knafo, it says v'naga bichnafo, meaning it's the thing that touched the sheretz then touched the bread, i.e. something that is not listed in the pasuk, something mysterious touched the bread, touched the sheretz, making it a rishon l'tumah, and then that is what touched the bread. So the bread was a sheni, which touched the stew, which was a shlishi, which touched the wine, which was a revi'i, which touched the oil, which made it a chamishi, and that is why the kohanim said that it was tahor, because chamishi is not a tumah thing. Tashma, come in here. I feel like there's something on my neck, but I don't think that there is. I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. What do you think? Oh, maybe some kind of a ghost. Tashma, come in here. Vayomer Hagai. Hagai then continues in the very next pasuk, and he says, Emiga tmei nefesh b'chol elah hayitma. And then Hagai asks, what if you have the same setup, but instead of the domino effect starting with, instead of the cascading effect starting with a sheretz, what if it started with a tmei nefesh, a tmei mace, i.e., a rishon netuma, right? Somebody who touched an aviyah vosatuma. So v'yanu hakahanim vayomer yitma. And this time, they got it right. This time they said, yeah, sure, it will be tameh. So now, Bishlama the Shmuel, so I understand Shmuel's opinion in terms of consistency. Just like they got it right in the second pasuk, just like they got it right when Hagai asked if instead of it being a sheretz, it was somebody who touched a dead body. So then if that person touches bread, the bread touches the stew touches the wine touches the oil, i.e. the oil being a revi'i, would it be tameh? And they said, yeah, sure, that would be tameh. So according to Shmuel, just like they got that right, so they also got the first pasuk right. And you'd have to explain that they said it was not tameh in the first pasuk because it was a chamishi. But according to Rav, why did they get the first pasuk wrong and they got the first pasuk right? I mean, it would be, let's say, cleaner at least to say that either they knew what they were talking about or they didn't know what they were talking about. According to Rav, how come they knew what was up in the second pasuk, but in the first pasuk they didn't know what was up? So Rav Nachman answers in the name of his Rebbe Rabbi Bar Avua. Well, they were more familiar with the halachis of corpses than they were with the halachis of sheretzes. Okay, I can hear that. So they knew that if a tmei mace were to kick off this cascading tuma, rishon, sheni, shlishi, revi, they knew that in that case it would be tameh. However, they were less familiar with sheretz, and that's why in the first case they made a mistake, but in the second case they knew the halacha. Ravina Amar Hasam Revi Hacha Shlishi. Whereas Ravina answers, and it says actually in that second case of the tmei mace, it wasn't actually a tmei mace. It wasn't actually somebody who touched a dead body, i.e. in avatuma. It was actually the mace itself, in aviyah vosatuma, which therefore means that actually the bread which touched the mace itself was in avatuma. The holy shnikes, but bread can't actually become an avatuma. One second, I'm just looking at something. The lechem av. Yeah, Rashi says the lechem becomes an avatuma. I thought that food can't actually become an avatuma. No? Who's got my answer? Who knows? Yeah, Ravina, I don't think that food can actually become an avatuma. Okay, so then I don't get Ravina. But what he's saying though, whether I understand it or not, what he's saying is that it was all being kicked off by a dead body itself. So the dead body is an aviyah vosatuma. The bread would therefore be an avatuma. The nazid would be a rishon latuma. The wine would be a sheni latuma. The oil would be a shlishi latuma. And therefore, they knew that, right? So in the second case, they knew that it was tameh because they knew that a shlishi latuma is tameh. What they did not know is that a revi latuma is also tameh, which is why they messed up in the first pasuk. Okay. Tashma komanir vayan Hagai vayomer. That Hagai answered and he said, Keno oma zeh v'chen hagoy azeh lifanai ne'um Hashem v'gomer. Right? God got, a little bit annoyed, and he said, wow, look at this good-for-nothing nation, Right? The pasuk then continues, and so is all of the things of the makings of their hands, and everything that they offer will be tameh. So it certainly sounds like Hashem was frustrated that the Yidden had no clue what was flying. So b'shlam l'Rav hanu dichsiv tameh. So I understand according to Rav, that's why at the end of the pasuk it says that whatever they offer is going to be tameh, because they demonstrated that they are unaware of the halachos of tumah. Ela l'Shmuel amai tameh. But according to Shmuel, why should there be any tumah? According to Shmuel, they knew the answers. In the first case, it was talking about a chamishi, and that's why they said that it's tahor. Second case, it was talking about a revi, that's why they said it was tameh. Right? They knew the halachos. So ismuye kametama. So Shmuel answers that no, it's not. Don't read it as a statement that whatever they bring is tameh. Read it as a question. Do you really think that whatever they would offer would be tameh? Of course not. They know the halachas, it would be tahor. Yes, but if you look in the pasuk, it says, and similarly, everything that they do will be tameh. So, like, definitely seems like it's not a question. It's a continuation of God's frustration and saying that whatever these nudniks do is going to be tameh. So, Amar Marzutra v'itemer of Ashi mitoch shekilkulus ma'aseim ma'le aleim akosov ki'ilu ikrivu betuma. So Marzutra says, some say it was Rav Ashi, that rather because they were nudniks, so then the pasuk treats it, even though yes, they did technically know the halachis of tumah and tahara, but because they were such nudniks, even their korbanos that they would bring b'tahara, in purity, were still kind of nudniki, and they and that is why they were considered to be tameh. Okay. Gufa, we said earlier, Rav Tani mashke beis mat b'chaya, the Levi tana mashke be mad b'chaya. Okay, interesting. So we learned at the end of the daf yesterday that Rav explains Yossi ben Yoezer ish Treda. Do you remember that? Yesterday, Yossi ben Yoezer ish Treda said that the mashke beis mat b'chaya are dachan, they're tahor. Okay, and we had a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, but doesn't mean that they're completely tahor, or maybe they can become tameh, but they don't impart tumah. Fine. Now Rav said at the end of the day yesterday that that's dafka talking about the mashkin in the base mat b'chaya, in the temple butchery, that refers to water and blood. Whereas Levi disagrees, and Levi says it's the be mad b'chaya. The mad b'chaya is the mizbeach, and on the mizbeach there is oil, right, in the menachis, and there is wine in the nisuchayayin, the wine libations. So hanicha, so where am I? So v'levi tana mashkin be'man b'chaya. Fine. Now Levi, so according to Levi, who says that the mashkin of the mizbeach, i.e., oil and wine, are tahor. Okay, well now we got some questions. If we're saying that the oil and the wine of the mizbeach are tahor, well then how do we explain the pasuk by Hagai, which is saying that you have wine that is touching oil and making the oil tameh? But according to Levi, if this concept of this mashke beis mat b'chaya is tahor, is referring davka to the mizbeach, i.e. to the wine and the oil in the Beis HaMikdash, well then they shouldn't be transferring tumah from one another, from one to the other. So Levi anicha isvir lekishmuel. Okay, so you can make sense of the pasuk in Hagai according to Levi if you hold like Shmuel, the Amar Dachan militame Tumas acherim, that Shmuel says that this mashkin, that we're talking about in the Beis HaMikdash, so they themselves can become tameh, but they do not impart tumah on other things. Okay. Aval tumas atzman yesh lahen, but they get their own tuma. So mishkachas la. So what you would do is you would explain the pasuk in Hagai in the following way: Dinage kulu barishon, that they all touched a rishon letuma. Meaning, the way that we've been understanding the pasuk in Hagai until now is that you had, the simple explanation of the first pasuk is that you had a sheretz. The sheretz touched bread, which then touched some kind of stew, which then touched wine, which then touched oil. Each thing being metame the next one. Now, that's going to be problematic if you say that the mashke base mad bechaya is tahor, that wine and oil in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor and they're not metame other things, because then how could the wine be metame the oil? But if you hold that it's referring to wine and oil, well, it could still make sense if you understand this like Shmuel explained yesterday, that the mashke base, either mat b'chaya or mad b'chaya, in this case mad b'chaya, they themselves can become tamei, they just do not impart things on to other things. So therefore, you can explain that what the pasuk means is not that they were all cascading down. It's not that it started with bread and then from bread to stew, from stew to wine, from wine to oil. No, it's that all of these things touched the sheretz, and therefore, they all became tamei from the sheretz, and that was that. But they wouldn't be able to impart things to other things. So ele isavar le kirav damar dachan mamish heichi mishkachasla. But if you're going to argue that Levi holds like Rav, that means that these mashkin, they don't become tamei bichlal. They don't become tamei. They don't impart tuma to other things. Well, then, how do you understand this pasuk in Hagai that's talking about oil and wine in the Beis Hamikdash becoming tamei? So clearly, it must be al korchech kishmuel svirle. So it must be that Levi holds like Shmuel, that the mashkin based mad bechaya are tahor, that wine and oil in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor, meaning that they're able to become tamei, they just do not impart tuma on other things. And the pasuk by Hagai that's talking about wine and oil becoming tamei is where they touched a sheretz, but the wine would be incapable of imparting tuma to the oil. Uli Shmuel. And now Shmuel, remember, Shmuel explained that first pasuk with the sheretz and the bread, and the kohanim said that it was tahor. So Shmuel said that they were not mistaken, that they were correct. Why were they correct? Because it was talking about a chamishi letuma, i.e., one thing was making the next thing tamei, right? According to Shmuel, you had a sheretz touched something, that thing touched bread, that thing, and then the bread touched the stew, which then touched the wine, which touched the oil, i.e., it was cascading according to Shmuel. So now, if that's the case, well then, u'de Shmuel hanicha isaver la kirav. Well then, you're going to have to say that Shmuel holds like Rav, meaning Shmuel argues with Rav with regard to that. Rav said that they were making a mistake. Shmuel said that they were not making a mistake. However, if we look at the other machlokas that Rav is involved in, namely the machlokas between Rav and Levi about is it mat b'chaya or mad b'chaya, so in that machlokas, Shmuel would hold like Rav, okay? That it's referring to the mashke of the butchery, i.e. water and blood. Because since Shmuel says that all those tumas were cascading, that one thing was being metame the next, well then if he were to hold like Levi, that it's tumas mad bechaya, i.e. oil and wine, that oil and wine in the temple do not become tamei, well then if that's the case, even if you say that they can become tamei, they just don't impart tuma on other things, well then how would these tumas be able to cascade from bread to stew to wine to oil? So rather it must be that Shmuel holds like Rav, that it's talking about water and blood that are unable to, that do not impart tuma to other things in the Beis HaMikdash, but wine and oil doesn't apply to it, and they can become tamei, and they can also impart tuma on other things, which is why the pasuk in Hagai was talking about wine and oil imparting tuma. So Shmuel, so according to Shmuel, who says that the pasuk in Hagai is talking about each one thing cascading to the next, i.e., wine being metame oil. So anicha isavrla kirav. So that makes sense if he holds like Rav. The Tani mashke base mat bechaya, who says that it's talking about the mashke in the temple butchery, i.e., water and blood. Hava mashke be mad bechaya achrine nami mitamu. But the mashke beit mad bechaya, i.e., oil and wine, they could be metame other things. So revi'i hu to lo avid chamishi. So he says that in that pasuk, the kohanim are correct in saying that the oil would be tahor, is because in that case the oil was a chamishi, hashlishi avid revi'i. But if it was a shlishi, it would make a revi'i. Ela isavar le kilevi, the tani mashke be mad bechaya. But if he holds like Levi, who says that the liquids in question are the liquids of the mizbeach, i.e., wine and oil, well then my irya revi'i to lo avid chamishi. Well then, how come that pasuk would have to be talking about specifically a revi'i and a chamishi? Afilu sheni v'shlishi nami lo avde. They wouldn't even make a sheni or a shlishi. Meaning, Shmuel says that that first pasuk is talking about that the kohanim said that the oil would be tahor because the oil would be a chamishi, and there's no such thing as a chamishi. But if Shmuel holds like Levi that the mashkin in the Beis HaMikdash that are tahor and are not metame other things are wine and oil, well then forget about the fact that the oil would have been a chamishi. I mean, wine wouldn't even be able to make oil a sheni or a shlishi, because we're saying that, if you would say like Levi, then mashke in the Beis HaMikdash just simply doesn't impart tuma on one from the other, the oil and the wine. So al korchech krav svirle. So rather it must be that Shmuel holds like Rab, that the mashkin in question are water and blood, but oil and wine would impart tuma from one to the other. Says the Gemara, Tanya Kavasi de Rab, Tanya Kavasi de Levi. We have a brisa that supports Rab. We have a brisa that supports Levi. Go figure. Tanya Kavasi de Levi. Here's the brisa that supports Levi. Hadam v'ayayin v'ashemen v'amayim. Blood, wine, oil, water, mashke be mad b'chaya, which are the mashkin of the mizbeach, right? Because on the mizbeach, in addition to wine and oil, there is also water and blood. Shenitmu bifnim v'otzian lachutz, that if they became tamei inside, and then you brought them outside, meaning they became tamei in the azara, v'otzian lachutz, then you took them outside of the azara. The azara is where, if you remember from the last daf of Masechta Eruvin, the azara is where the mizbeach was in the Beis HaMikdash. So if you took these liquids from inside, right, and they became tamei inside the azara, then you took them outside of the azara, tahorin, they are nonetheless tahor. Nidmu bachutz v'chnisam b'fnim tamein. If they became tamei outside of the azara and then you brought them into the azara, then they're tamei. So what do we see? So we see that any of these liquids that became tahor, tamei in the azara, i.e. the mashke beis mad b'chaya, these liquids by the mizbeach, we're saying that even though they became tamei, since they became tamei only inside of the azara, they remain tahor because the mashkin beis mad b'chaya are dachan, are tahor. Now the Gemara says, Ini, is this really so? That if you were to bring these mashkin from inside the azara to outside the azara, outside of the azara, they would remain tahor. Ve'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, mashke beimad v'chaya lo amru dachan ela b'mkomon. But Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that the mashkin of the mizbeach, they are only tahor in their place, i.e. in the azara. My lav lemute nitmu bifnim v'otzion lachutz. Mistam, what that means is that if they became tamei in the azara and you took them out of the azara, they would no longer be tahor. Right? Meaning because in the azara, they're tahor. Meaning even if they become tamei, they remain tahor, because that's like the whole thing, is that the mashka beis mat b'chaya, they remain tahor. But if you take them then out of the azara, then mistam they'll become tamei. Lo, nitmu b'chutz v'chnisam b'fnim. No, the whole thing about being bimkoman is to the exclusion of if they became tamei outside of the azara and then you brought them into the azara, they don't magically become tahor. V'bimkoman kamar. What do you mean? But it says in the proper place. Doesn't that imply that if you take it out of the azara, it will in fact become tamei? Hachi kamar lo amrudachan el shenitmu bimkoman. No, what it means is that when it's tahor, it means that if it became tamei inside of the azara, it remains tahor. But if you take it out of the azara, it'll remain tahor. Doesn't just magically become tamei when it goes out of the azar, and also the opposite, right? If it became tamei outside of the azar, it doesn't magically become tahor when you bring it into the azar. Tanakavose de Rav, we have a brisa supporting Rav. Hadom ve'amayim mashke beis matbechaya, blood and water, which are the liquids of the temple butchery. Shenitmu bein bekelim bein bekarka, and then they became tamei in the azara. In the azara. Bein bekelim, bein bekarka, whether they were in vessels, whether they were in some kind of a pit on the ground, tahorin, they remain tahor. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon bekelim tmein bekarka tahorin. If they became tamei in vessels, then they are tamei. If they became tamei in the ground, so then they are tahor. So what do we see? So we see that according to Tanakama, right, according to Tanakam, really no matter what, whether it's bekelim or bekarka, these mashke beis mat b'chaya become tahor, so we see davka remain tahor, so we see davka, it's talking about mashke beit mat b'chaya, the butchery, as opposed to the mizbeach. Amar Papa has an interesting theory. Afilu l'manda amar tumas mashkin d'oraisa. So even according to the manda amar, who says that tumas mashkin are d'oraisa. Now, if we think back to yesterday's daf, all the way at the top, which we got to at the end of really 2 days ago's daf, we saw that there were a few different opinions. We had the opinion of Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, and then we had Reb Yossi and Reb Shimon. We said that Reb Elazar held like Reb Meir, right? So Reb Meir had said that mashkin contract tuma midoraisa, but they only impart tuma midorabanan. And Reb Yehuda said that, basically Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, and Reb Shimon essentially said, and we're going to see Reb Yehuda's opinion in depth in a few minutes, they said that mashka imparts tuma midoraisa. And then we wanted to say, it's machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, but perhaps Reb Elazar says that actually mashka doesn't even contract tuma bichlal midoraisa. So now says Rav Papa, afilu manda amar tumas mashkin deoraisa, even according to Manda Amar, who says that the tuma of liquids is midoraisa. Mashke beis mat b'chaya hilchosa gemirela. However, the liquids of the temple butchery is alach l'moshe misinai, meaning even if you hold that midoraisa mashkin can contract tuma, however, we have alach l'moshe misinai. Now, alach l'moshe misinai is the status of a deoraisa, that in the temple they do not contract tuma. Now, this is interesting because up until now we've been really dancing around, tiptoeing around the limitation, or working within the limitation, that this whole mashka beis mat b'chaya thing only applies to derabbanans. It can't override a deraisa, which was the kasha on Reb Elazar yesterday, right? Because initially we said that Reb Elazar holds like Reb Meir, that liquids can contract tuma midoraisa, but they only impart tuma midorabanan. And the kasha is that Reb Elazar seems to be quoting Yossi ben Yoezer Ish Tzreda, who says that mashkin beis mat b'chaya are tahor. And if Reb Elazar says that they contract tuma midoraisa, how could this idea of mashka beis mat b'chaya override a deoraisa? So we've been assuming now that until now that mashka beis mat b'chaya being tahor is not midoraisa, and therefore it can only override their abundance. But Rav Papa is coming up with a big chiddush, which is saying that this whole thing about these liquids being tahor is taka halacha l'moshe misinai, and therefore it can, basically what we're saying is even if you hold that Tumas mashkin is midoraisa, this halacha Moshe Misinai is saying, look, move over when it's in the Beis Hamikdash, i.e. in the Beis Hamikdash, the Tumas mashkin would not apply. Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Nasan the Rav Papas. Now Rav Huna Breder Rav Nasan says to Rav Papa, "Ve'elah hada Amar Rav Elazar." But one second, this doesn't make sense because Rav Elazar said, "Ein Tumah l'mashkin kol ikar." We saw yesterday Rav Elazar says that there's no Tumah for mashkin midoraisa bichlal. And what's his proof? Teda, you should know, Sharei Heid Yossi ben Yoezer is Treda Hamashke Beis Mat B'chaya Dachan. And Rav Elazar's proof that mashkin are not Tamei Midoraisa is that Yossi ben Yoezer is Treda said that the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor. Now the whole point of his proof is saying that if Yossi ben Yoezer is Treda is saying that the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor, that must mean that mashkin do not contract tumah midoraisa, because if they did, then how could this concept of the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash being tahor override a deoraisa? Rabbi Elazar's whole proof to say that mashkin are only mitami midirabanan is that since Yossi ben Yoezer Yisrael says that the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor, then it must be that mashkin bichlal are only tamei midirabanan to begin with. But if Rav Papa, you're correct that actually this whole purification of these liquids in the Beis Hamikdash is halacha Moshe Misinai migamrinon mina, then how can Yossi ben Yoezer Yisrael be a proof for Rabbi Elazar to say that mashkin is only tamei midirabanan? Because if it's halacha Moshe Misinai, then Yossi ben Yoezer Yisrael would even override the oraisas. The Ravina the Rav Ashi. Now Ravina continues and he says to Rav Ashi also as a kasha on Rav Papa. Reb Shimon de Omar Tumas mashkin de oraisa. Reb Shimon, he says that Tumas mashkin is midoraisa. The Tanya, as we learned in the Brisa, as we learned at the beginning of Tezayin Amud Aleph. Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon Omrim, says Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon lakelim tohorin, that when you have mashkin that's safek tameh, and then it possibly touched vessels, so we say that would be tahor, but the ochlin tamein. But these ochlin, these foods would be tameh, because since mashkin imparts tumah mida oraisa, so therefore you have to suspect that this food is tameh. So we see that according to Reb Shimon, tumas mashkin is mida oraisa. V'acha ka'amar Reb Shimon b'chelim tameim b'karka tahorim. And over here, Reb Shimon is saying, i.e. at the very, very top of our Amud, Reb Shimon said that if you have these liquids, if you have water or blood that becomes tamei inside of the Beis Hamikdash, so if it's in a kli, it remains tamei. We'll see in a minute why in the ground it would be different. But if it's in a kli, it's tamei. But v'ihilchasai mali b'kelim mali b'karka. But if it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai that all these mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor, well then who cares if it's in the karka, if it's in the ground, or if it's in a kli? It should be tahor, because we have halacha l'Moshe Misinai that all the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash are tahor. So kasha, rather it must be, we have these two questions against Rav Papa. It must be that this mashkin Beis Mat B'chaya is not halacha l'Moshe Misinai, and it can only override the rabbanans, and that's why Reb Shimon says that if it's in a kli, if you have this mashkin that became tamei in the azara, and it's in a kli, well then it will be tamei, because the tumas mashkin is midoraisa, and this concept of the mashkin in the Beis Hamikdash being tahor cannot override the oraisa. Amar Rav Papa ado amat bekarka tahorin. When Rav Papa says that, when Reb Shimon says that if this liquid that presumably became tamei in the Beis Hamikdash was in the ground, but in some kind of a pit in the ground, it's tahor. Lo shanu ela maim. So that's only talking about water, it's not talking about blood. Aval dam lo, but not blood. Umayim nami, and also the water lo amru, lo amar and ela tavi revius. The chazil adbil be machtin v'tzinoros. Interesting. And when we say that if it's in the ground, there has to be at least a revius a revius halog, and it's like a few ounces of water, enough that you could put like a needle of sorts in there, and it'll be tahor. Mida oraisa, that would be enough to be tahor. Avalo ave revius tmein, but if there was not a revius of water there, it would be tamei. Fine. Amar Mar, we said at the very top of Daf Tazayno. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lakol tamei. Rabbi Yehuda says that mashkin are metame everything. Water, kalim, everything. The Meimer Desav Rabbi Yehuda Tumas mashkin the tame kalim to oraisa. Is that to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, liquids are metame kalim mida oraisa? V'atanya. We learn in a brayso called a kalim sheish loin achorayim b'toch. Oh, if you have vessels that have an outside to it and an inside to it. Kigon, for example, akarim b'aksasos, pillows and cushions, v'asakin, sacks, v'armatzofen, some other leather kind of kli. Nitma tocho, nitma gabo. So if the inside of the kli becomes tameh, well then the outside of it becomes tameh. Nitma gabo lo nitma tocho. But if the outside of it becomes tameh, the inside of it remains tahor. Amar Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, Amurim, what are we talking about? Shenitmu machmas mashkin. Only if they became tameh from liquids. If they became tameh, so if you have some kind of a sack and the outside of it becomes tameh from liquids, so only the outside of it is tameh. The inside of it remains tahor. But if the inside of it became tameh, then even the outside is tameh. Aval nitmu machmas sheretz. But if the sack became tameh from a sheretz, nitma tocho, nitma gabo. If the inside of it became tameh, then the outside of it is tameh. Nitma gabo, nitma tocho. If the outside of it became tameh, then the inside of it is also tameh. Now, listen up. Tumas mashkin the tameh kelim de oraisa. Now, if Rabbi Yehuda really holds that Tumas mashkin is metame kelim de oraisa, well then mali nitma machmas mashkin, mali nitma machmas sheretz. Then why does it make any difference if this sack became tameh because tameh liquids touched it, or if a dead sheretz touched it? Because Rabbi Yehuda was explaining this brayso, saying that when we say that only the outside would be tameh but the inside would remain tahor, that's only if tameh mashkin touched the sack. But if a dead sheretz landed on the sack, well then the whole thing would be tameh. But if we're saying that Tumas mashkin is mida oraisa, well then what's the difference if it's mashkin or if it's a sheretz? It's the same thing. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chazub Rav Yehuda, period. So Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel that Rav Yehuda actually changed his mind. Whereas yes, in the brayso at the top of the Daf Tazayin, the brayso over there said that according to Rav Yehuda, mashkin would impart Tumah mida oraisa, but he actually retracted and said that they only impart Tumah mid'Rabbanan, which is why he says that if Tameh mashkin lands on the outside of this sack, so then only the outside of it would be Tameh, but not the inside. We've actually been holding on to this thought in our minds for almost a year now, because this came up in the discussion of Tumah and Tara in the 8th parak of Masechta Brachos, right? We learned over there that if you would have like some liquids that would come Tameh, they would get on the outside of the cup, so it would be matame the outside of the cup but not the inside of the cup, because it has to do with that whole Tumas mashkin derabanan thing, right? That, really mashkin can only be a rishon l'tumah, and rishon l'tumah cannot be matame kelim. However, we say out of concern with the ma'ayonos hazav, we say that mashkin can be matame kelim to be a sheni. But even so, it's only going to be matame from the outside. If it gets on the outside, it'll only be matame the outside of the kli, not the inside of the kli. This was so that you'll, to make a distinction between Mayonos Azav, which is an avatum, is Matami Midoraisa, and this liquids, which are only Matami Midarabanan. So by saying that only the outside will become Tami, but not the inside, it makes a distinction between Tuma Midoraisa and Tuma Midarabanan. Ravina Amar, says Ravina, Lo'olam Lo Hadar, says Ravina, really, you do not need to say that Reb Yehuda changed his mind. He says, no, it just depends how the liquids got tameh. If they became tameh from your hands, i.e. midar abanon, so then it won't be tameh the sack. But if they became tameh from a sheretz, well then it's tameh midar oraisa, and it will be tameh the sack. Okay, fine, Seder. Okay, but I have questions on that. But the Gemara has their own questions on it. Then the Gemara says, yeah, but the reason why we don't like that, Ravina, is that the Gemara is already making a differentiation and saying, well, it depends if the sack became tummy from liquids or if it became tummy from a sheretz. So once already we're making a distinction, so then make the proper distinction, which is that furthermore, b'medzvar mamurim, when do we say that only the outside is tummy but not the inside? B'mashkin haba and machmas yadayim, that's liquids that became tummy from your hands. I eat tummy midrabanan. Ava b'mashkin haba and machmas sheretz, but liquids that became tummy from a sheretz, nitma tocho, nitma gabo, nitma gabo, nitma tocho. Well then, if the liquid became tummy from a sheretz, well then, if the inside became tummy, then the outside will be tummy. If the outside became tummy, then the inside will also be tummy. Rather, it makes more sense, like Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, that Rabbi Yehuda retracted his initial position and instead holds that liquids only impart Tumah and other things midrabanan. That was Daf Yud Zayin of Masechta Pesachim. Let us go over a few things from the Daf. We started off with the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel concerning the knowledge of the kohanim in their test by Hagai, that according to Rav, they were making a mistake because they got the question of, is there a concept of Revi Batuma wrong? They said no, but the answer is yes. Shmuel said no, they were correct. They were being asked about a Chamishi Latuma, and they correctly said that there is no such thing. We had a machlokus between Rav and Levi about this whole thing about these liquids in the Beis HaMikdash being tahor. Is that Beis Matbechaya, the butchery, which would be water and blood, or is it mad b'chai the mizbeach, which is wine and oil, or we saw it could also potentially also include blood and water as well, since there's blood and water on the mizbeach. And at the end we saw along the way a thought by Rav Papa that maybe this whole thing about the mashkin in the Beis HaMikdash being tahor is actually halacha l'Moshe Misinai, but we had two questions on that, so it doesn't seem like that's really plausible. And then we discussed Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. We said initially Rabbi Yehuda had said that mashkin impart tumah midoraisa, but we said if that's the case, how do we understand this brisa in which Rabbi Yehuda says that if you have mashkin that are matame a sack, it's only matame the outside, not the inside, which is a very dirabanani kind of thing. So therefore, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that he actually retracted from his initial position, and he holds that mashkin only impart tuma midrabanan. Well, that was Daf Yud Zayin, Gematria Tov. It was a good daf. Peace.